company that says, well, we want somebody with experience from this industry because it's our industry, may be missing the best practices that you can learn from other industries. So that'll be my perspective. And as a past board chair of the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, I remember it was almost 20 years ago when they wanted to change the name to Supply Chain Management something. And I said, I'm willing to change the name as long as we can define what supply chain management is. It took 2 years. Nobody agreed. We had 300 corporations from around the world giving us their definitions. It was 300 different definitions of what supply chain management is. So even though, as my co-speaker said, we're trying to talk about supply chain management, the reality is few people in the world understand what it is or recognize the true value. Dave, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and what's interesting, one positive thing from COVID-19 is at least people can spell supply chain now. and before that, we couldn't, people couldn't even spell it. We do have a question from the audience, so we'll get to that in a minute. But I think what's important, and we all mentioned COVID-19, and all of us have been in supply chain for a long time, know that we have disruptors all the time, and this is certainly a major disruptor. But why is this different than any other supply chain disruptor? Anyone want to start first?
Well, I can start. I mean, we use the term black swan. This is something that not only is it a black swan, being that it's something that surprised us all. We could say, okay, we know it's going to happen at some time in our lifetime or maybe in the next 100 years, but we're never fully prepared for it. But when this hit, unlike a 9/11, it was global. It creeped up on us. We were unprepared for it. It disrupted all of the economies on a global basis. It shut down borders. So it was unlike anything that we've ever experienced in our modern lifetimes, meaning where we've got technology and we're so dependent on crossing borders and having imports, exports, and relying on our supply partners and our customers. So it disrupted everything. And we don't know when there's going to be an end to it or how to really solve the problem.
Yeah, I remember, just a quick comment. I remember when it started in the local news here in Texas asked me to comment on it. And I said, we in supply chain talk about the bullwhip effect. I said, but we've never, ever seen a bullwhip the way this occurred across everything. Paul, maybe to follow on to what Joel has said, because you're probably buying for clinical study, buying a lot of APIs, and how has that been impacted as a disruptor from an API standpoint? And Karen, you can probably allude to that too.
Well, for lots of companies, it's quite impactful. For Illumina specifically, not so much, because again, we have a lot of our supply chain is controlled in-house and manufactured domestically, or at least in countries that have had less impact, as in Singapore. So from that perspective, good. But across other companies, not so good. And the number of disruptions is quite high. If we look at some of the data recently published from Deloitte in COVID times, that 53% of companies don't have backup plans, 98% are likely to experience a disruption in the next sort of 24 months. And we see lots of labs having the same issues. So 73% of labs have shortages of test kits across all different uses unrelated to COVID. So lots of supply chain shortages, but for Illumina, fortunately, not so much.
So maybe
Dave, this is Roddy here. Can I chime in with a couple of comments? First of all, we just commissioned a disruption in supply chain report with IDC. because we went out and looked for the impact of disruptions on healthcare supply chains, and we really couldn't find anything besides natural disasters. So we literally built a survey, and we went out to just less than 600 companies. We're about to finally approve the white paper, and I can share the slides with you. There's some really good data in that. And I think it provides some startling numbers, like, for example, the fact that, we specifically said how many companies are re-engineering their supply chains around patient-centric. Now, I led supply chain at AMR Research for 15 years and was instrumental in coining the demand-driven value network term. And yet in the life sciences industry, patient-centric is no, we don't go there. That's going to complicate things. And it's because the implications of pivoting the supply chain from supply-driven 300 days of insurance policy to, cell and gene therapy with a few patients scattered here and there in different therapies is a nightmare for the supply chain. So I will share that information. I will also share with you, as part of my presentation on Randy's panel, some perspectives from that study. So I look forward to working with all of you.
Okay, thanks, Roddy.
And Dave, I might just add just a couple of very quick comments. Completely agree with Joel's comments in terms of the global nature. Global demand as global production was constrained. I might have a bit of an academic argument with you after this session, Joel, in terms of whether or not this really is a black swan event, and whether or not we knew this was coming, because I think, in doing some of the research, there's a fair amount of literature kind of warning of this, but I don't think ever warning it to the nature. I mean, this is a new type of virus. Even though it is a coronavirus, there's enough new aspects of it. And as we think about urbanization, and as we think about the fact that animals and people are living closer together, and we have these things that transmit, and I think we need to be prepared for these kinds of situations going forward.
So, Horacio, maybe do you have any comments on this? Why this is a major disruptor? Because I want to get to a couple of questions that the audience is. I didn't know whether you had some comments or not.
Sure. Well, I think in regards to traditional biotech pharma, is the issue of API is a very serious one. Many organizations source globally and have much of their manufacturing dispersed for many reasons, including risk management and also regulatory and compliance reasons across the globe. So the question is, what are these organizations doing right now? Whether it's a small allogeneic CAR T clinical stage company like an Allogene, or a large multi-decade in existence organization like Roche and Genentech. They're really looking at a few aspects. I mentioned earlier some of the supply chain risk and resiliency elements, but looking at their manufacturing and distribution models are things that are under intense scrutiny. Not only that, but the quality and compliance aspects globally continue to be a strain and actually a need for these organizations to further evaluate. Of course, the health pandemic is a new type of dimension, a new risk element that has to be taken into account. And then the relationships from a business approach with their suppliers and third parties. So organizations in a matter of skunk works are developing sub-teams focused on what type of information and data is out there free, how much of it can be purchased via social networks and third parties, and how much of the risk-related data is proprietary. Because organizations are the ones that are going to have to deal with the risk. And so there's a lot of proprietary data that is being brought together along with free data across the World Wide Web, as well as purchase data. So these models around risk and resiliency, to Karen's point of whether or not this is a black swan event or not, it has pushed these organizations into and in front of board of directors and senior leadership, because now this is a mainstay of the actions related to the normal business operations. It's understanding the risk, and then the actions that organizations are taking include internal manufacturing of products that they would, let's say traditionally or prior source outside of the organization. If you think of some of the key starting materials for biotech, pharma in leading technology sub-industries, things like blood products that's dependent on donors and the screening of donors, lentiviral vectors or vectors in general, plasmids, other blood-based products, talent, genetic engineering and genetic manipulation of the human genome. These types of products have to be close to the source of manufacturing. And in some cases, you hear of organizations like Kite that have gone out and have established their own lentiviral manufacturing facility. So one of the results is, besides evaluating the risk and establishing a resiliency in the organization, is vertical integration. So we see more and more of companies bringing in the technology, bringing in the resources, and in some cases, M&A type activities of organizations to help shore up and have them be more of an independent entity and reduce the dependency on third-party suppliers, service providers, and distribution logistics partners.
Yeah, I think you bring up a few good points, because I remember when I was still in the industry, when it came time for APIs, it was let's source it out of China and let's source it in other areas because it was a lot cheaper. But one of our attendees asked the importance of traceability of API supply chain, given the national security issues raised during the pandemic. And I want to add to that before anyone answers that. There has been a concern. First of all, API has been the intellectual property in a lot of cases for the pharma industry. And secondly, is that the traceability from end to end has been really lacking in the past. So is there been an improvement in API traceability because of the pandemic? Has that changed people's philosophy? Anyone want to take that one?
Sure. I'd like to add on that, because there's two main efforts across the globe, and they're all based on serialization and traceability, chain of custody. These types of ideas and thoughts are being managed in quite different ways. In the European Union, we see the Falsified Medicines Directive, FMD. It was a mandate across the EU organizations to comply from manufacturer to distributor to dosage, is essentially a track and trace the serialization of product from source to patient. And this is really key. In the US, it's a bit slower. It's taken the approach of more of a capitalist approach, and we have many organizations and many integrators in the Drug Supply Chain Act. And so it's very distinct. We had due dates of the end of November of this year, and because of COVID in the US, the adoption of these types of programs in the US will be pushed out. But it's really important, because what COVID presents is an opportunity for false and falsified drugs. We have heard many horror stories across the globe of patients expecting chemotherapy drugs, and they're receiving nothing more than Pedialyte infusion. So these types of activities need the controls, again, from source to distributor to hospital and clinical environment. And serialization, I think, is going to receive more scrutiny across the organization, because we're about to be in a position where we're going to be potentially second guessing whether or not our COVID vaccine is true, and that the labeling from the manufacturer has not been falsified, has not been adulterated, or is not corrupt. So I think serialization, chain of custody, traceability are going to be tested and stressed in the next 6 to 9 months as the COVID-19 vaccine makes its way to patients.
Okay, and I don't know if I got out of that whether or not we're going to get better traceability in API. I think serialization may bring that, but Karen, from a GHX standpoint, I think you're seeing what Horacio said, you're probably seeing more activity to try and do a better job, at least trying to get consistency across the supply chain when it comes time for API.
With absolutely, and I can speak more broadly than some of my colleagues to APIs, but in general, there is a renewed conversation about how do we make those investments in, first of all, I think organizations themselves just understanding. Hospitals, for example, have been mandated to provide information on some of the critical products that have been in shortage based on how, they have to report how much they have, what their anticipated demand is, when their next shipments are coming, which of course requires them to have information upstream from their distributors and their suppliers, who also need to understand those risks. Are they running into, diamond supply chains upstream or other kinds of how can they communicate their ability to supply? Because what happens when people go on allocation, they are, they figure out they need 1,000, but they're only getting 200 from their regular vendors. So they're placing orders for 1,000 from 5 different vendors, and that completely obscures the demand signal. There's a lot of attention on this ability to start having the data and sharing the data. And then to the points that Horacio made in terms of, what products do we need to serialize? How do we build that traceability? And I always say it comes down to the basics. We got to call the same thing, regardless of what we're doing with the thing and where the thing is and who has it. We've got to be able to adopt those standards and that standard language.
Yeah, and I think in the past, the industry has not been very good at standardizing across the entire supply chain. And I think, Joel, Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think the regulatory piece of that is important and will help, but we still have to get the basics right of picking suppliers we trust, suppliers we've audited, suppliers we have a good relationship with, and stay in very close contact with them. And we can put in other kinds, our own systems in terms of that visibility and digital connection in terms of forecast and supply. But it's really starting with suppliers hopefully you've had a long-term relationship with and and trust, and and layer on top of that, the regulatory aspect of track and trace and serialize.
But, and Paul, you brought up, you initiated this whole thing of collaboration, because I know in supplier management, collaboration is really, really important. But maybe, Joel, you can talk a little bit about, how important is collaboration to ensure continuity of supply? Because I know that during the COVID that there has been some disruption in supply in the pharmaceutical area, but in other areas as well. So, how important is collaboration, especially in this Zoom world?
Yeah, I can't give you a scale of 1 to 10 how important it is, but I can say it's certainly important. I know when Horacio was talking about vertical integration, when we take a look at vertical integration, it's because we don't trust collaboration, right? We need to bring it in-house, we need to protect it, we need to control it. Collaboration is saying you're going to have partners that you're going to trust. And the whole secret about having a collaborative relationship is everybody has to win that's in this relationship. There can't be, in the old days, if you think of just transportation, one of the 5 key points that the vendor brought up, it was always beat up the carrier. Well, carriers aren't going to cooperate. They're not going to work with you. So it's the same thing with anybody else in this collaborative relationship. If you treat any one of the entities that are so important in a collaborative relationship as a lesser equal, and that you try to leverage your size or your importance with that potential partner, the collaboration is going to fail. So the first thing that has to happen is that all of the stakeholders, all of the partners in this collaborative relationship have to win in some tangible and measurable way, and it'll work then. So I think the collaboration is absolutely critical. I know I've taken a look at some technology applications that can identify, one, hotspots around the world. So where's COVID-19 popping up, and where are certain supplies needed? So you can see the hotspots, you can see the supply, and you can see the quantities involved. But how do you get all of these entities to start sharing information or sharing the product that's so necessary?
Thanks, Joel. And we've only got about 4 minutes left. And I know we have another question from the audience, but I'm going to defer that question to another panel, to Prashant's panel, because it's specifically about distribution. And I know that Prashant's going to talk about it. But I'd like to take the next 4 minutes, and each of you taking a minute and saying, what's the message, the drivers or the enablers during this time? What do you believe they are, and what's your last thought to give to the audience? We'll start with Karen.
So I think one of the things that we're not talking enough about are our opportunities to leverage more advanced manufacturing. I think, every single country in the world is talking about, hey, we need to have all this domestic manufacturing, when our supply chain, as we all well know, is very, very global. So that's not going to work. But how do you create this balance? And I think one thing that the pandemic has shown is, people have said healthcare slow to change. I have seen every single organization, from hospitals up to suppliers to tier 2 to people are changing. They're doing things differently. And I need to applaud the FDA, because they had already stood up a few programs related to whether it was continuous manufacturing or additive manufacturing. Certainly hospitals and local manufacturings have been looking at flexible. I'm excited about the opportunity to invest, for example, in more disadvantaged communities. Can we stand up warehouses there? Can we stand up manufacturing, which has one of the best multipliers for job creation, and could potentially not only solve some supply chain reliability issues, but we also can address some of the fundamental societal issues where we have seen folks, low income, people of color who have suffered from more severity of COVID. So I'm excited about our ability to collaboratively work together. And there's been a lot of collaboration, even among competing hospitals, among competing manufacturers, et cetera. How do we work together? And how do we utilize some of these technologies, whether it's our ability to develop vaccines faster, or whether it's our ability to generate that domestic manufacturing and availability of product and the raw materials that are needed.
Okay, so we're down to about a minute. So Paul, couple comments or?
Yeah, I'd say one is just you analyze your company's priorities. It used to be cost savings, and I think now it's going to rotate more back to availability. And that ties into your product rationalization in your portfolio. And we're seeing that in many industries now. People are eliminating those less important SKUs. And so really concentrate, if you're going to be able to make products, make the most important ones. And then back on this topic of collaboration, it's longer term collaboration, not flipping your suppliers every few years for a better price until we kind of get through this. But it's to the point, as Karen was saying earlier, there may be more of these coming. And so I think we're in evolving our priorities in the supply chain back to that stability and less on cost and just-in-time lean manufacturing.
Well, we've run out of time, but I think we can take maybe 15 seconds from Horacio or Joel if you've got some last minute comments.
Well, I can comment on all those things, but what I will say is one of the questions here was regarding the military getting involved in the distribution. And I can tell you that if we go back to the Gulf War, back in the 90s, early 90s, there was a guy named General Gus Pagonis, and he was in charge of military logistics in the Gulf. And he said to Schwarzkopf, he says, I will take control of the distribution, all of the logistics, if I have control of everything. So he had to have control of the Army, the Air Force, the Marine, the Navy. He said, I can't do it piecemeal. So if the government is going to get involved in this, there's got to be a central point of contact and accountability. It can't be pieced out to the various branches.
Well, that's a good safe way into Prashant's panel later. Sorry, Horacio, I think we run out of time, but I really want to thank the panel for a great discussion. I think hopefully that the audience have gotten something out of it. So thank you so much, panel, for being a part today. Thank you so much.